uh, thank you, to run various A/B tests, different marginal iterations. You're trying to come up with the best ideas possible and see if they perform at all. The time for learnings comes next when you are scaling your creative strategy. So how do we do that? Let's start with some research tactics. Of course, everyone knows about the meta ad library, but not everyone is using it in all the ways that are possible. And one of the interesting ways that we've discovered is keywords. And if you actually pick not just United States, but the whole world out here and use different relevant keywords, not just for your industry, but that are kind of adjacent to your product or your service, you will find some really, really interesting organic pieces of content that are being promoted, various brands that have ads running all around the world. And this provides you with a lot of amazing ideas. Then, of course, you can look up your competitors' ads. You can, and you should. And everyone knows about this, but we have found out that not many people look for the oldest competitors' ads. And the oldest running ads are usually the ads that have been performing the best, especially if you see the ads that have been run in different iterations, like these examples from Magic Spoon. You can take those examples, analyze them, come up with your own hypotheses for why you think they're performing. And of course, we don't recommend to copy the ads exactly, but you can take those hypotheses and use them for your product or your service to come up with some really, really strong theories. And then your first round will be super competitive. Then, of course, you can look on TikTok. Again, you can search by keywords, you can search by countries. And Meta, we have some success with TikTok trends on Meta, so you could try that. But mostly when we're doing research on TikTok, we are recommending to look at different interesting text treatments, at the way people deliver their testimonials, and then you use those kind of best practices and repack them in a way that's most organic for Meta. When you're running the analysis of your competitors or just other ads, we recommend to pay attention not just to overall concepts and messaging, but also the tiny details that might not seem very important at first, like colors and text treatments and tone of voice and mood. So like the overall vibe. You might not even use the actual concepts that other ads have, but you might use like the overall vibe and try to replicate the feeling that people get when they're watching it. And after you run your analysis, you should have a lot of different patterns that you've noticed about various ads. So try to see the patterns that are uniting some of the oldest ads. And even if you run just that analysis alone, you will find some very interesting trends that you can use to come up with your own strong hypothesis for your first round. Like if you look at these examples from Calm, you will notice some things that they are using across a lot of their ads that have been running for years now. And of course, you don't copy their ads exactly, but you just use some of these underlying things that are probably giving their ads their success. Another tip that is not super common when looking for inspiration is looking at GDN ads. We are not partnered up with Mo. This is not an advertising, but it's just one of the tools that we use to do research. The cool thing about GDN ads when analyzing them is that they are very concise. Because of the format, people can't fit too much information into them. And so you can find a lot of really interesting ways to package information in a very concise and minimalistic way. And then you can use those techniques in your meta ads. And the ads from Grammarly are actually pretty cool. So we analyze those a lot. And finally, another tip is if you guys have been subscribed to our newsletter, you know that we have years and years of research there. And now we save all of our newsletter ads on this one page. You can search them by type, by industry, and you can get a lot of inspiration that way. And of course, we do it ourselves. So in the end, your first round to test the viability of a channel will look something like this. Well, it doesn't have to, but if you want it to be diverse and if you want to maximize your chances of success, you will end up with something similar to this, especially if your brand allows it. So you can have something like kinetic typography with a moving animation. This was a video originally. Then you might have like a more classic UGC, a screenshot of a tweet or a Facebook comment, something organic looking, something like a meme or a very, again, organic or UGC driven photo. And finally, a static ad or an illustration. As you can see, again, we didn't pick anything with with stock of photography because that tends to work the worst. We do not recommend that. So you would have a round that is very diverse, and then you will not get many learnings from it straight away because the main thing you're looking for is, does any of these ads perform so well that it gives you hope that you want to invest more in this channel and test more. And that's when the time will come for a scalable, more robust strategy. So let's talk about the case where you want to create a strategy that scales, where you want to get the learnings that can be extrapolated. We usually start by testing value propositions. Now, value propositions tend to include different things for different people in the industry. We tend to put kind of everything that's valuable under that umbrella. So that includes features, that includes pain points, essentially anything that is useful for your audience. That includes education, so not even the direct uses of your product or service, but just any value that people might derive from it. And when you're coming up with value propositions, they should be as specific as possible. We see this very often where in the heads of like the team that works on the brand, they have just so much information and so many different uses for their product that they try to, or they come up like with very abstract terms for its usefulness, like, oh, it saves time, it's very convenient, it improves performance, it improves your mood. And to them, it says a lot. And they think that having like more abstract, more broad terms will attract a broader audience and increase the chances of success for the ads. But that's actually not the case, because Meta algorithm, and actually all the algorithms at this stage, are really good at picking the exact audience for your value propositions. So you want to make them as specific as possible so that the chances that people will want to make a purchase and convert are really, really high. Otherwise, you're kind of looping in everyone who's sort of interested, and it might get very expensive. So instead of something like convenience, you can come up with a particular case that sounds realistic and is described in a language that people would actually use to talk about this value proposition or their pain point. And we also recommend to use stats if you're talking about anything that's quantifiable. And of course, the stats have to be real, but if you don't have the exact stats, it's okay to use something approximate just to give people an idea of the exact improvement in whatever you're talking about. Another good idea in testing value props is to test them in the form of metaphors and analogies. Here are some examples from Mudwater. They tend to do it really well. It is still as direct as, talking about your product in the exact words that you would use, say, on your landing page or on the packaging, but coming up with analogies and metaphors and making it more visual just makes it more interesting, and people are more likely to linger on your ad more. And then because of the visual examples, it stays in their memory, becomes more emotional, and they're more likely to convert and to remember your brand. Now, how do we test the value props? The simplest way to test them, that is not as popular right now for some reason, is testing them with static ads. I know that videos tend to perform better across different industries, but when you're running your original tests, it is so much cheaper and faster to test your first value propositions with static ads. So here's an example from Zero. They are doing this a lot with pretty much every new round that they're launching. And it's a great example because the vibe of these ads is exactly the same. So when you're testing value propositions in static ads, you want the copy and the actual value propositions to be the only thing that you're testing. The rest of the ad should look more or less the same or exactly the same. So here you see some examples that are exactly the same, but these first and fourth are, they give essentially the same impression and leave the same emotional mark on people as these two ads would. So for the purposes of this test, these ads look exactly the same. And once you figure out which value proposition performs the best, you can use that to create further iterations and come up with really interesting new hypotheses. Then the second way that is very popular right now, of course, is the UGC. Here are some examples from pros. They are also very good at doing this. So the idea is you simply put a different piece of copy in the beginning, which we call the hook, and the rest of the video is exactly the same, and then you see which one performs the best. The great thing about this is that most people only watch 3 to 5 seconds of your video ads. So you're testing the part that makes the most impact. And usually those results extrapolate really well and remain true in evergreen ads. However, the thing about testing hooks is that, again, we see a lot of examples where creators kind of forget to keep strong hypotheses in mind when coming up with them. And they're trying to come up with various examples of hooks that perform well so that they can use them again and again without thinking about like the future of the strategy, how these hooks are going to get fatigued, and you're going to be left with essentially having to start from scratch. When we're testing value props, it's not just about coming up with or like finding the exact value props that perform well. You're trying to build a very comprehensive portrait of different segments of your audience. You're trying to figure out what are their tastes, what are their preferences, what are their pain points, how do they talk about those pain points, so that when your hypothesis about a certain value prop turns out to be correct, you can use this to further your learnings and to run more and more tests, as opposed to being stuck with just one hook. So like an example would be that if something like this performs for you, your hypothesis could be that for a more mature audience segment, you need to use more science and facts as opposed to gimmicky and catchy slogans. And this gives you a much wider space for experimentation in future, as opposed to just repeating this hook or rephrasing this hook again and again and again. And testing value props should always go hand in hand with how they are presented. So you can't just run a test and decide that a certain value proposition is going to perform well, no matter how you phrase it, no matter where you put it, no matter what the design is for your ad. How it's presented really, really matters. And we're going to go into the art direction in a moment, but even as you're running your original tests just for value propositions, you should pay attention to the language that people are using, the type of humor that resonates with them, tastes and preferences, their interests. It helps to look into the different Reddit threads to see the language that people are using. And of course, you should check their comments to see how they're responding and what they want to see more and less of. Then when you have your best performing value propositions, try to move into the art direction tests. We often mix those tests, and once we have a few value propositions that are performing well, we continue to test value propositions while branching out for each of them and starting to test art direction. But if you want the results to be really, really clean, you can start with just value proposition tests and then move into the art direction tests. So art direction is a very broad term. Obviously, you can work with a professional art director and come up with very complicated and sophisticated ways to test it. But the examples we're going to discuss here are really simple and can be done by most in-house teams or even by pretty much every person who has a phone. Because the most important learning from your art direction tests is just figuring out a vibe that performs well for your audience. So what constitutes a significant art direction test? This could be design composition, various shapes, textures, colors, amount of negative space and white space, so like the amount of space that you leave around your text, and different elements. And for videos, it could be the voice of the creator, their tone, how playful they are, how serious they are in their delivery, the music. This matters a lot for the dynamic, and the type of lighting that works for your product or for the creators that are talking about it. Now, what constitutes some insignificant art direction tests? For performance, and this is important, when we're talking about performance, the tests are very different from tests for brand awareness. For performance, any of the finagling around your logo usually don't matter at all. So moving the logo a little bit up and down, left and right, making it smaller, larger, your brand's name is going to be above your ad anyway, and most people are going to remember the feeling they had from the ad, and they're going to make a decision whether they buy your product or they don't. But if you want your ad to perform immediately, you should focus on what your product does and the value that you're delivering, and not trying to put your logo everywhere. So we recommend to kind of forget about your logo, just keep it small somewhere and focus on the actual product. Another things that don't really deliver meaningful results are tests about like CTA buttons at the end of the video, changing the colors from like slightly darker to slightly lighter, all of those things that you notice and your brand team notices because this is kind of your baby and this is your brand and you worked on it for a very, very long time. and you care about it, but your audience is very unlikely to pay attention to this. So if you want to run the tests that actually deliver you results that can be used further and extrapolated and build upon, you should concentrate on things that are more noticeable for most of the people watching your ads. So like an example would be, these are now some ads that we ran for our clients. And we obviously can't show you the exact numbers, but the difference in CPA for some of these ads was really, really drastic, like 2 to 10 times. So an example would be using a cooler color for your background versus a warmer color, using more or less contrast between the product and the background. This is a really simple change, very easy to make, and the results are very, very different. Second example would be tests for your composition, the way you put different elements, the way you use different brand elements and kind of interpret the brand. This is obviously the same concept, but one of these ads was the best performer in the round, and one of these ads was the worst performer in the round. So it makes a huge difference. And then you can run more fun tests with textures if your brand allows for that. Different textures are really fun to work with. If they look organic and kind of a little DIY and messy, people tend to respond to them really well. And again, the results for exactly the same copy for the same concept might be very, very different, and you might get some really interesting surprises. And then you can run tests that are a little more sophisticated. Like this is our example for Leon and George. You might get wonderful results. Again, they might be very different as they were for these two ads, but they are pretty hard to analyze. So if you're just starting your tests, I would recommend to keep your hypotheses as clean and as simple as possible, so that it's easy for you to analyze them. And then as you have accumulated more learnings, you can move on into more sophisticated territory. So to summarize, when we're talking about art direction tests, if you try to go outside of your comfort zone, and if you push your brand to do the same, you might get very surprising and wonderful things happening to your ROAS. Now, let's talk about the numbers, the interesting and scary part for a lot of people in the creative industry. How do we analyze the raw data, and how do we turn it into creative learnings? So it's actually not scary at all, and it's pretty simple. You don't need to know maths. You don't need to have a degree in data analytics to understand this. To start, you need to look at only these three main things. And then as you get more experience analyzing things, you can look at kind of the adjacent data and get more and more learnings from those more like subtle signals that you get from the algorithm. But to start, the most important metric for you is what you're optimizing for. And if you have been to our previous webinar, or if you're familiar with the strategy that Meta recommends, you should be optimizing for something as further down the funnel as possible. So usually it's cost per acquisition, or it's your cost per lead, cost per trial, or ROAS, if you're into that. We recommend to use CPA as the main metric that you're looking at. So this will allow you to tell Facebook and Instagram, on the old name, you're telling Meta what you want to look at the most, so that it will find the exact audience that wants to convert after looking at your ads. Then you want to look at the number of successful events so that you ensure statistical significance for your ads. And what this means is you don't need to run any formulas. It's usually pretty intuitive. So if you see that the ad barely got any spend or had a very cheap conversion, like the CPA is super low, but it only had one conversion, then the learning is just not meaningful enough. And you have to ensure that the ad either gets more budget, or you restructure your test, you work with the growth team, and you rerun the test. We usually try to get each of our ads to spend an equal amount within the creative test. But if that's not possible for some reason, you have to look at them in comparison to each other. Just try to see, especially if the ads, if your CPA is very high on average, if your product is very expensive, you might not have the budget to have many successful events. So just compare the ads to each other. But obviously, in cases with super expensive products, 3 successful events is better than 0, and 5 is better than 1. So if you get only 1 result somewhere, you might still have to rerun it, or just not use the learnings you got from that ad. And then the final metric that everyone used to look at a few years ago, and now it's kind of forgotten sometimes, undeservedly so, it's the CTR. So the percentage of people who saw your ad and clicked on it. Of course, it doesn't ensure success. Very often, an ad will have high CTR, but will be very expensive for acquisition. But it does provide important information. So let's go through the 4 main cases between the pairs of these 2 main metrics. All of these imply that you had some significant results, that all the numbers that you're looking at have statistical significance. So the first case is you have low CPA and you have high CTR. This is amazing. Congratulations. This means your creative performed really well. Now, what you should be cautious about a little bit is that it could be that your hypothesis was actually incorrect, but the ad performed really well. That's why you should always try to test your hypothesis further if you have that opportunity. So if you had a theory, you had a strong value prop, or a new art direction that you picked for the value prop, and it performed really well, it still might be that the ad performed well for some other reason. So create another ad that is based on the same hypothesis and see if it still works. If it does, you have a very conclusive learning that you can build on, and a learning that scales. The second case is you get high CPA and high CTR. So this is the case that sometimes gets discarded altogether when people analyze creatives, because you look at it and you're like, well, the ad didn't perform well. We're just going to look at the ads that did perform well. But if it did have the high CTR, it means that the audience did have interest in your ad, but something went wrong along the way. So your job is to figure out what could possibly go wrong. What was that missing step? Is it that maybe the landing page doesn't provide enough information? Or does it perhaps provide too much information and people get lost in that kind of ocean of words? So you should try to go through the journey that people go through, that your audience goes through. Click on the ad, go to the landing page, and see what you experience and what could be fixed. Or was it maybe that the ad was misleading, that it had one piece of information and the landing page told something different. So it looks shady or confusing. Or maybe your ad was too clickbaity and it attracted the wrong audience. All of these learnings are extremely important because if you figure out what went wrong, you will not make the same mistake or like run the same test again, and you will not waste money. The third case, you get low CPA and low CTR. This happens a lot. You shouldn't be afraid of the low CTR. A lot of the best performers can have really good CPA, but low CTR, simply because the audience is small. Maybe your offering is too niche. So people who do click on the ad understand exactly what you're talking about, and they go straight to the action point. But there's simply not enough of those people. However, if you do see that your CTR is low, there's still things you could look at and improve on. So try to think what could make your ad a little bit more attractive. Maybe it's more contrasting colors, maybe it's bolder hooks, maybe you should get to the point faster. Maybe you shouldn't start with the logo in the first 3 seconds of your ad. So again, just go through the journey that your audience goes through and try to really imagine what it's like for them and what might be attractive and not attractive for them. And the last case is you have both high CPA and low CTR. This is something everyone is trying to avoid. But again, don't just discard that ad that didn't perform well. Try to find as many underlying characteristics, various traits that are different between this ad and the other ads, especially if you have a hypothesis and you branched it out and one group of ads performed really well and another didn't. So if some of the ads got really bad results, your job is to find out what made them perform badly. And if you have some strong hypotheses about that, try to cautiously test them again. Maybe test some of your other best performing value props with this art direction that didn't perform and see if it still doesn't perform well. It's important to have these learnings because if you know which colors, which tones, which type of copy doesn't perform well for your ads in pretty much every case, then this can inform not just your decision about your future ads, but also how you structure your landing pages. Maybe what tone of copy you use for your product in general, how you position your product and service. So there's a lot to learn as long as you know what to look for. And finally, what can you do with these learnings? Well, you can and should systematize them and try to come up with new hypotheses in an informed way. So going back to sort of those hooks and building the portraits of the audience that we talked about, this is one of the examples of how you could potentially do it. So if, for instance, you see that calm voice in your UGC performs better than something more energetic, you could build your future tests on this hypothesis. Like your future concepts would be informed by this learning. You could try various ASMR videos, you could try different calming imagery and see if it performs as well. And if it does, then you would have a piece of the portrait of your audience that tells you that your audience performs this kind of calm and relaxing vibe. And the other two things you could do with the learnings is you can certainly test them on other channels. They tend to extrapolate pretty well if your hypotheses were strong. Or you can make them, you can continue to make them more granular and run further iterations to get even more detailed learnings about your audience. And then finally, it's very important to remember that you're interacting with real people. Don't get disappointed or frustrated if you see that their needs and tastes and preferences change. If something that used to work for you doesn't work anymore, it's okay, because they're real people. You're building a relationship with them. As long as you're paying attention to it and show that you care about their emotions and their reactions, they will appreciate it, and so will your ROS. That's it for me. Thank you for listening.
Awesome.
Let's get to the questions.
Yeah, we got a couple here for you. First one is, how is creative production for social media ads different from creative production from social media organic posts? I've heard that popular posts can be used as ads because they already have engagement, but that suggests the post is created to be a good ad.
That's a great question. We find a lot of value in analyzing best performing organic posts, but they usually can't be literally taken and reposted right into the ad manager. You still need to cut them in a way that works better for direct advertising. One of the things that we changed is we try to get to the point faster. For organic, the storytelling works really well, but if people get really personal and takes like 15 seconds to get to the point about what they're talking about, we try to cut that part. And then in the end, you want to still add some sort of action point and not just end abruptly. Or you can use that analysis for different trends like music and just like challenges that people do, and use that in your ads.
Awesome. The next one is, what is the general timeline for these phases, value prop, art direction, etc., when running test ads?
Yeah, also great question. It depends on how many value props your product has. If you can come up with like 20 off the top of your head, we would recommend to start mixing the test for value props and art direction maybe after 2 or 3 rounds. If you have a very limited amount of value propositions, it might be useful to just finish testing them all and then move into art direction tests. But usually value propositions should get like 2 or 3 rounds, and then you should move either into a hybrid approach or full art direction tests.
Awesome. Next one is, what are the tips for marketing internationally where it's difficult to determine trends?
Yeah, it is.
The answer is yeah, that's hard.
yeah, it's hard. I mean, the process remains the same. You just have to look at more signals and more data points, right? And maybe be more cautious with how your learnings extrapolate. Like the things that we learned about running ads internationally is that the color palettes and the art direction are unlikely to extrapolate as much as the value propositions do. So if you're running tests internationally, it might make more sense to dedicate more budget to value proposition tests and to keep your art direction tests to a minimum.
Nice. Next one is, at what point in the process do you test the audience? Do you nail value props and creative first, then try different audiences, or vice versa?
Yeah, usually vice versa. We tend to start with the audience tests, and then we move into the creative tests. But if you're just starting with the channel, right, you need like to have some ads that are performing in order to run some audience tests. So that's why we started by talking about the viability of the channel. You just try to come up with something that works, then you test the audiences, and then you test the creatives.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Next one is, can you talk a little bit more about creative fatigue on ads? How often do you recommend refreshing winning concepts?
Often. Yeah, fatigue is a bigger problem on TikTok than it is on Meta. But that's sort of the main purpose of running creative tests at all, right? Because depending on your product, your service, the trends in your industry, the fatigue will be different. And it's also different by season, different trends fatigue faster and slower. So you don't want to be in a situation where you have like 2 ads that are getting all of the budget, and yeah, it's working great, but then you see that they're getting fatigued and you don't know what to do because you don't have any other hypotheses. Even if you have those 2 best performers, you should continue to run creative tests so that you have more learnings about things that work and don't work, so you can address the fatigue when it happens.
Yeah, and one way I think about this is that you're in 2 different types of auctions in an abstracted way. One type of auction is the sort of financial auction. People are bidding on an audience, and so kind of creative is attached to an audience. So that might get more expensive. So you might have audience fatigue, even though it's actually at the creative level. And the other one is the visual auction you're in. So like as people are scrolling up and down, you're in almost like an auction of sorts of getting someone's attention compared to everybody else, both within your industry and on the platform at large, right? So those things can happen, and they're sort of like different per brand usually and per audience. So you just have to keep an eye on these things.
Yeah.
Next one is, what is the minimum ad budget you'd suggest starting with for testing?
Obviously, it depends on your average CPA. I think this question would be better addressed to the person leading our previous webinar, but usually we're trying to get what, 5 conversions and 50 events to get out of the learning mode, right?
Yeah, and I included that webinar in one of the previous answers. If you go to the answers tab in the Q&A section, we have like a whole formula we use for this. Next one is, do you find UGC ads for Meta can be reused for TikTok, or is it a TikTok UGC as a unique beast?
No, it's not that unique. I think they can be used on both platforms, but you might not get the same best performers. And TikTok has like slightly different sort of ethics in beginning and ending your ads, because people love those abrupt meta approaches. You might like launch right into the story and then end it abruptly with no CTA whatsoever, and it will perform really well. While for Meta, you have to have a beginning and an end and like a more structured approach.
Sense. Next one is, I market a blog, not a product. How do you market for something vague, like concepts that are spoken about? Like, why is there pain in life as opposed to an actual product?
That's a great question. We face that when we market some of the stuff for our blog. The process is very similar, actually, but instead of coming up with like value props for every single blog post, you just come up with kind of like different succinct ways to describe what is happening in that post. So in a way, it could be described as a value prop, but it's more just like the most important learning that people could get from that blog. And then you test art direction a lot.
Awesome. I think last one, do you have any advice on how to keep track of creative test findings? Working on dozens and dozens of clients each week, I find it difficult to keep track of what findings we get for each client.
Yeah, that's also a great question. We have some clients. Our oldest client, I think, has been with us for 3 years, and it's now a huge Figma board of various learnings. We try to keep a visual library of everything that performs art direction wise in Figma. So it's like either screenshots or just like pieces and elements of design that perform well. And then the other learnings, like about copy and value propositions, we just keep track of either in Notion or ClickUp. We have like these systems for sort of like a tree of ideas for those. And yeah, there's no one perfect way, obviously. It's hard.
Yeah, we feel your pain on that one.
Sure.
There's no more questions, but there's things like, thanks, Mary, that was great. And great presentation and information, if you want to respond to those.
Yeah, thank you guys for listening. Appreciate you coming here. Did Leela respond to any questions?
Yeah, I had one, and I wonder maybe if you had, well, I had one that maybe you had a different take on about using dynamic, the dynamic function within Meta. I said that we prefer not to use it within our creative testing, but we have used it before, like in certain cases.
Yeah. We prefer not to use it because it doesn't give access to great learnings. But if you know what works for you and you just want to optimize for the best results, it might work for you to run those tests. You're just not going to learn much from them, but you might get good performance.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for doing this. We're going to give you 5 minutes back on your day. You're going to get a recording of this, although we missed the first 40 seconds. That's my bad. You get a recording of this and the slides that Mary walked you all through. If you have any questions, feel free to email us. I'm nima@pearmill.com, got Mary@pearmill.com, and Leela@pearmill.com. And if you'd like to work with us, you can email Allison@pearmill.com or myself. We're available to chat with you all. Thank you so much and have a great Wednesday.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary. Bye.
Bye.